Hello everyone, welcome back to Buried Files. Tonight we bring you 7 deeply disturbing, true small-town horror stories that will make you question what really happens when communities exist in isolation, far from the eyes of the outside world. These are not fictional tales, but real encounters shared by people who discovered that the most terrifying places in America are not abandoned forests or haunted houses, but the seemingly ordinary towns where everyone knows your name, and secrets are buried deeper than graves. Each story has been thoroughly documented through first-hand testimonials, witness accounts, and verifiable records that confirm these events actually occurred. Small towns across America hold darkness that most people will never encounter, and perhaps that is for the best. If you enjoy authentic horror content that will disturb you long after the video ends, subscribe to Buried Files and hit the notification bell so you never miss our latest investigations into the unknown. After you listen to these chilling accounts, we want to hear from you in the comments below about your own experiences in isolated communities or unexplained encounters. Now settle in as we explore the horror that hides behind closed doors and drawn curtains in towns that do not appear on most maps. Samuel had recently moved to Millbrook, a quiet town of barely 800 people nestled deep in the Appalachian foothills of eastern Kentucky. What began as an opportunity for a fresh start and escape from the chaos of Louisville quickly turned into an uncomfortable and unrelenting experience that would fundamentally change how he understood human nature. He had chosen the town specifically for its isolation and the remarkably low cost of living, thinking the slower pace would be exactly what he needed after his divorce, and the subsequent breakdown that had cost him his teaching position. The local real estate agent, a woman named Martha, who seemed pleasant enough during their phone conversations, had promised him peace, friendly neighbors, and a tight-knit community where everyone looked out for each other. She had made it sound like something out of a Norman Rockwell painting, a place where doors remained unlocked and children played freely in the streets until well after dark. But when Samuel pulled into his driveway on that first evening in late September and noticed every single house on his street had their curtains drawn, yet he could feel eyes watching him through the cracks. Things took an unexpected turn that he could not have anticipated. The town seemed friendly enough on the surface, with its well-maintained Victorian homes and pristine white church steeple rising above the town square. But before long, it became clear that Millbrook had rules, unspoken ones that outsiders were expected to follow without ever being told what they were or why they mattered. The first week passed in an eerie silence that Samuel initially attributed to small-town reserve and natural suspicion of newcomers. He was a 32-year-old man who understood that trust had to be earned, especially in communities where families had lived for generations and everyone else was considered an outsider until proven otherwise. He made efforts to be friendly, waving to neighbors when he saw them collecting their mail or tending their immaculately kept gardens. But something felt wrong in a way he could not quite articulate. When he waved, people would freeze mid-motion, stare at him with expressions that seemed almost frightened, and then hurry back inside their homes without acknowledging his greeting. At the small grocery store on Main Street, conversations would stop the moment he entered, and other customers would abandon their shopping carts and leave through the back entrance as if his presence contaminated the air itself. The cashier, a teenage girl with dark circles under her eyes, would ring up his items without making eye contact. And when he tried to make small talk about the weather or ask about local restaurants, she would simply shake her head and point to the total on the register screen. He told himself he was being paranoid, that he was projecting his own anxieties onto innocent people who were simply shy or unused to strangers. The second week brought the first note. Samuel found it tucked into his screen door when he returned from an unsuccessful job interview at the regional high school in the neighboring county. The paper was aged and yellowed. The handwriting spidery and old-fashioned, written with what appeared to be a fountain pen. It read simply, "Do not walk past the Miller property after sunset. Do not ask why." There was no signature, no explanation, and when Samuel looked up and down his street, he saw no one who might have left it. The Miller property, he had learned from the brief tour Martha had given him, was the large farmhouse at the end of Maple Street, about 4 houses down from his own rental. It looked abandoned, with boarded windows and a yard that had gone wild with weeds and thorny bushes. Though he had noticed that someone must maintain it because the grass was cut and the porch was swept clean, he had thought nothing of it before receiving the note. But now it took on a sinister quality that made him uncomfortable. That evening, testing the warning like a child testing boundaries, he deliberately walked past the Miller property at twilight, his heart pounding with irrational fear. Nothing happened. No one emerged from the house. No supernatural force struck him down. But when he returned to his own home, he found his trash cans overturned and his welcome mat flipped upside down. And he knew with absolute certainty that someone had been watching and had sent him a message. The third week brought more notes, each one containing cryptic warnings that made no logical sense, but carried the weight of absolute authority. Park your car facing east, never west. Do not hang red curtains in your front windows. Avoid the town square on Tuesdays between noon and 1. Never whistle after dark. Samuel tried to laugh them off as the work of bored teenagers or a mentally ill neighbor. But the specificity of the rules and the fact that they kept coming suggested something more organized and deliberate. He began to notice patterns in how his neighbors behaved. Every car on every street faced the same direction. No house had red curtains, though many had red doors or red shutters. The town square, which featured a gazebo and a memorial to Civil War soldiers, was indeed completely deserted every Tuesday at noon, though the shops around it remained open and people simply avoided entering the central area. And he never heard anyone whistle, not once, not even children playing in their yards during daylight hours. When he tried to break these unspoken rules deliberately, consequences followed swiftly. The day he hung burgundy curtains in his living room, he found a dead crow nailed to his front door. When he parked his car facing west, all 4 tires were slashed overnight. When he whistled while taking out his trash after dinner, his electricity was cut off. And when he called the power company, they insisted there was no outage reported and no explanation for why his home had lost service. By the 4th week, Samuel realized that people were not just avoiding him, but actively crossing the street when they saw him coming, as if he carried some contagious disease or had violated laws so fundamental that his presence offended them on an existential level. Shopkeepers would flip their signs to closed when they saw him approaching, even though he could see other customers inside. The postman began leaving his mail at the end of his driveway rather than bringing it to his door. Children who had been playing would be called inside by their mothers the moment he stepped onto his porch. The ostracism was so complete and so coordinated that Samuel began to doubt his own sanity and perception of reality. He had done nothing wrong that he could identify, committed no social offense beyond being an outsider who had failed to intuit rules that no one would explain. He felt like he was living in a nightmare where everyone had agreed to pretend he did not exist, or worse, that his existence was an active threat to the community. The isolation began to affect him physically. He lost weight because he could not bear to go to the grocery store where he would be treated like a leper. He stopped sleeping well because he could hear footsteps on his porch at night and knew that people were checking on him, watching him, monitoring his compliance with rules he did not fully understand. The breaking point came 5 weeks after his arrival, when Samuel decided he had had enough of the silent treatment and the cryptic warnings. He was an educated man, a former high school history teacher with a master's degree, and he refused to be intimidated by what he had come to think of as small-town cult behavior. He would confront these people and demand answers. He would make them explain their rules and justify their treatment of him. On a Thursday afternoon, he walked to the home of Evelyn Patterson, the only neighbor who had ever spoken to him, though only once, and only to tell him that he should leave Millbrook before Sunday if he valued his peace of mind. She was an elderly woman who lived 3 houses down in a neat yellow cottage with a garden full of chrysanthemums. When she answered his knock, her face went pale, and she tried to close the door. But Samuel put his hand against it and insisted on an explanation. What she told him in a whispered rush of words made him question whether the entire town had lost its collective mind or whether he had stumbled into something far stranger than he had imagined. Evelyn explained that Millbrook had been founded in 1842 by a religious sect that had broken away from mainstream Presbyterian doctrine over issues of predestination and community purity. The original founders had established a complex system of rules and traditions designed to keep the town spiritually clean and protected from outside corruption. These rules had been passed down through generations, evolving and multiplying over nearly 2 centuries. And they governed everything from which direction residents parked their cars, to what colors they could display in their windows, to where they could walk and when. The rules seemed arbitrary and superstitious to outsiders, Evelyn admitted. But to the descendants of the original families, they were sacred obligations that protected the town from divine judgment and supernatural harm. Breaking the rules brought consequences, not from any human enforcement, but from the town itself. Or so the residents believed. Evelyn told Samuel about families who had violated major rules and had suffered house fires, accidents, and mysterious illnesses until they either left town or made proper amends. She told him about an outsider in the 1990s who had refused to follow the traditions and whose teenage daughter had vanished one night, never to be found. Though her screams had been heard throughout the town, and no one had gone to investigate because it was after curfew, and the rules forbade being outside after midnight. Samuel felt his blood run cold as Evelyn continued. She explained that he had unknowingly violated multiple sacred rules in his first weeks in town. He had walked past the Miller property, which was forbidden because 3 generations of that family had hanged themselves in the barn, and the ground was considered cursed. He had hung red curtains, which symbolized blood and violence in the town's symbolic language. He had parked facing west, which represented the direction of death and the setting sun. He had whistled after dark, which was believed to summon malevolent spirits that the founders had tried to keep outside the town boundaries. Each violation marked him as ignorant at best and actively hostile to the town's way of life at worst. The community had been patient, sending him warnings and giving him opportunities to correct his behavior. But his continued defiance had pushed them to the point where they had no choice but to take action. Evelyn told him that he needed to attend the town meeting on Saturday evening at the old church to make formal amends and commit himself to learning and following all the rules. If he refused, or if he did not attend, he would need to leave Millbrook before Sunday morning, or the town would make him leave through methods she would not specify, but that she promised he did not want to experience. Samuel left Evelyn's house shaking with a mixture of fear and anger. Part of him wanted to dismiss everything she had said as the delusions of an isolated community that had inbred itself into collective insanity. But another part of him, the part that had felt the watching eyes and experienced the coordinated ostracism and seen the immediate consequences of rule breaking, believed that these people were serious and potentially dangerous. He spent Friday packing his belongings, determined to leave this cursed town and never look back. to return to Louisville and rebuild his life somewhere, sane and normal. But when Saturday morning arrived and he tried to start his car, the engine would not turn over. He checked the battery, the alternator, the starter, everything he could think of with his limited mechanical knowledge. But the car was simply dead in a way that made no sense. When he called the only mechanic in town, the man laughed and hung up on him. When he tried to call a tow truck from the neighboring county, his cell phone lost signal, even though he had had perfect reception all month. That evening, as the sun began to set, Samuel stood at his front window and watched as the entire neighborhood gathered in the street outside his house. Men, women, and children, dozens of them, maybe more than 100, all dressed in dark clothes and all standing in perfect silence. They formed a semicircle around his property, facing his house, not moving, not speaking, just watching him with expressions he could not read in the fading light. He noticed with growing horror that many of them held objects. Ropes, shovels, lanterns, and items he could not identify, but that filled him with primal dread. Evelyn stood at the front of the crowd, her face sad but resolute. Samuel locked his doors and turned off his lights, his heart pounding so hard he thought he might have a heart attack. He called 911, but the operator who answered asked for his location. And when he said Millbrook, she paused for a long moment and then said that no such town existed in the county records, and she could not send help to a place that was not on the map. The line went dead, and his phone would not make another call. The crowd remained outside his house all night, standing in the street, watching and waiting. Samuel did not sleep. He sat in the darkness with a kitchen knife in his hand, listening to the silence and wondering what would happen when morning came. As dawn broke and light crept across the street, the crowd finally dispersed, melting away into their homes as if nothing had happened. Samuel found a final note slid under his door. It read, "The town meeting is tonight at 7. Your attendance is mandatory. This is your last chance to become part of Millbrook or to cease being anything at all." Samuel looked at his dead car, at his useless phone, at the empty street that had been filled with watching figures all night. He realized that he had no choice. He would go to the meeting. He would learn their rules. He would become whatever they wanted him to become, because the alternative was something he could not bear to contemplate. And because he understood now that Millbrook did not let people leave once they had seen what lay beneath its peaceful surface. Aria was a 24-year-old freelance photographer who had built a modest following documenting the slow death of rural America through haunting images of abandoned main streets, shuttered factories, and communities that time had forgotten. She had traveled to Thornwick, a remote town of barely 600 residents tucked into the rain-soaked forests of the Oregon coast, after reading about it in a thread on a photography forum dedicated to vanishing American towns. The person who had mentioned Thornwick claimed it was one of the last truly isolated communities in the Pacific Northwest, a place where the population had been slowly dwindling for decades, and where the remaining residents clung to old ways with a determination that bordered on obsession. Aria had arrived on a gray October afternoon when the fog hung so thick between the massive Douglas firs that surrounded the town that she could barely see 50 feet in any direction. The town itself looked like it had been preserved in amber from the 1950s, with a single main street lined with brick buildings, an old movie theater with a marquee advertising a film from 1987, and a general store with a hand-painted sign that had weathered to near illegibility. But what immediately caught her attention was the frenzied activity taking place throughout the town as residents prepared for what they called the Harvest Festival. The moment Aria parked her car in front of the only inn, a 3-story building with peeling white paint and a porch that sagged alarmingly. She was greeted by the innkeeper, a woman in her 60s who introduced herself as Margaret and who seemed almost desperately pleased to see a visitor. Margaret insisted on carrying Aria's bags personally, refused to accept payment for the room, and kept repeating how wonderful it was that Aria had arrived just in time for the festival. When Aria asked what the harvest festival entailed, Margaret's enthusiasm became even more pronounced, her words tumbling over each other as she described a celebration that had been held in Thornwick every year since the town's founding in 1889. It was a time of community bonding, Margaret explained, when everyone came together to give thanks for the harvest and to ensure the town's continued prosperity and protection. The festival would take place in 3 days, on the night of the new moon, and Margaret insisted that Aria simply had to stay and document it with her camera. It would be unlike anything she had ever photographed, Margaret promised. A genuine slice of authentic American tradition that had been preserved unchanged for over a century. Over the next 2 days, Aria explored Thornwick with her camera, capturing images of the festival preparations that struck her as increasingly bizarre and unsettling. The residents were constructing enormous effigies in the town square. Human-shaped figures woven from branches and dried corn stalks that stood nearly 15 feet tall. At first glance, they appeared to be typical harvest decorations, the kind of folk art scarecrows one might see at any autumn festival. But as Aria examined them more closely through her telephoto lens, she noticed disturbing details that made her skin crawl. The faces of the effigies had been crafted with unsettling precision, their features so realistic that they seemed to be grimacing in pain or screaming in terror. The bodies were positioned in poses that suggested torture or execution, with arms twisted at unnatural angles and heads tilted back as if in their final moments of agony. Stranger still, each effigy wore clothing, not the simple burlap or rags one would expect, but actual garments that looked worn and lived in, as if they had been taken from real people. She noticed jeans with grass-stained knees, a jacket with a name tag still pinned to the breast, a pair of sneakers that showed signs of regular use. The symbols painted throughout the town disturbed Aria even more than the effigies. Every building, every lamppost, every fence had been marked with elaborate designs in what appeared to be a mixture of red paint and something organic that had a rust-brown color and a smell that made her gag when she got too close. The symbols were not decorative or festive. They were harsh geometric patterns interspersed with images that seemed to depict violence and suffering. Figures with their throats cut, bodies hanging from trees, circles of people surrounding a central form that appeared to be burning. When Aria asked Margaret about the meaning of the symbols, the innkeeper's cheerful demeanor faltered for just a moment, and she said that they were protective marks, traditional designs that kept the town safe from harm. But the way Margaret avoided making eye contact when she said it made Aria suspect there was far more to the story than she was being told. By the evening of the second day, Aria had decided she had enough photographs and was ready to leave Thornwick before the festival took place. Something about the town and its residents had begun to make her deeply uncomfortable in a way that went beyond simple unease. People watched her constantly, tracking her movements with an intensity that felt predatory. Conversations would stop when she approached, and residents would smile at her with expressions that never reached their eyes. When she told Margaret at dinner that she would be leaving early the next morning, the innkeeper's face transformed from friendly to something much colder and harder. Margaret insisted that Aria could not possibly leave before experiencing the festival, that it would be a grave insult to the community's hospitality, and that the roads out of town were far too dangerous to travel at night. when Arya pointed out that she would be leaving in the morning, not at night. Margaret's smile became fixed and unnatural. And she said that the roads were dangerous during the day as well, that strangers often became lost in the forest and were never found, and that it would be much safer for Arya to wait until after the festival when some of the local men could escort her to the county highway. The insistence felt less like hospitality and more like a threat, and Arya went to bed that night with her door locked and a chair wedged under the handle. She lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of activity outside her window as the townspeople continued their preparations through the night. She could hear chanting in a language she did not recognize, rhythmic and repetitive, punctuated by the sound of drums and what might have been bells or chains. At some point, exhaustion overcame fear, and she fell into a troubled sleep filled with nightmares of burning figures and symbols written in blood. When she woke just after dawn, she discovered that someone had been in her room while she slept. Her camera bag had been moved, though nothing appeared to be missing. Her car keys, which she had left on the nightstand, were now sitting on the windowsill, as if someone had picked them up and examined them. Most disturbing of all, there was a wreath of twisted branches and dried flowers hanging on the back of her door. And she knew with absolute certainty that it had not been there when she had gone to sleep. Arya grabbed her belongings and rushed downstairs, determined to get to her car and leave immediately, festival or no festival. Margaret's warnings be damned. But when she reached the lobby, she found it full of townspeople, at least 20 of them, all sitting in silence and all turning to look at her the moment she appeared at the bottom of the stairs. Margaret stood at the front of the group, still wearing her unnaturally wide smile, and announced that everyone had come to invite Arya personally to be a guest of honor at the festival that evening. It was a tremendous privilege, Margaret said, one that had not been extended to an outsider in many years. Arya would have a special role in the ceremony, a part to play that would make her an integral part of Thornwick's continued prosperity. The way Margaret emphasized the word integral made it sound less like an honor and more like a sentence. Arya managed to maintain her composure and thanked the assembled residents for their kind invitation while explaining that she had a prior commitment and really did need to leave that morning. She could feel the temperature in the room drop as she spoke, could see the smiles on the faces around her harden into something resembling hostility. One of the men, a tall figure with hands that looked too large for his body, stood and moved to block the front door. Another man positioned himself at the back entrance to the inn. Margaret's voice took on a tone of patient correction as she explained that Arya did not seem to understand the situation. The festival required a certain number of participants to be effective, and they had counted on her presence when she had arrived so fortuitously 3 days before. The town had needs, Margaret said, and sometimes individuals had to make sacrifices for the greater good of the community. It was the way things had always been done in Thornwick, and it was the way things would continue to be done. Panic began to claw at Arya's chest as she realized she was trapped in a room full of people who had no intention of letting her leave. She thought about screaming, but who would hear her in a town where everyone was complicit in whatever was happening? She thought about fighting her way to the door, but she was one person against dozens. Instead, she forced herself to smile and told Margaret that she had misunderstood, that she would of course be honored to participate in the festival, and that she had simply been concerned about imposing on the town's hospitality for longer than planned. The lie seemed to satisfy Margaret and the others, and the tension in the room eased slightly. The residents began to file out, each one touching Arya's shoulder or arm as they passed, their fingers lingering just a moment too long, their eyes searching her face as if trying to determine whether her compliance was genuine. Once she was alone again, Aria went to her room and tried her cell phone. But there was no signal, which was not unusual in remote areas, but felt sinister under the circumstances. She went to the window and saw that her car was surrounded by people, not obviously guarding it, but positioned in such a way that she could not possibly reach it without being seen and stopped. She was truly trapped, and the realization made her want to vomit. She spent the rest of the day in her room, trying to formulate a plan, trying to understand what was really happening in Thornwick and what role these people intended her to play in their festival. When she searched through the room more carefully, she found something that made her blood freeze. Hidden behind the dresser was a backpack, dusty and clearly forgotten, with a Colorado driver's license in the front pocket belonging to a man named James Chen. According to the license, he had been 26 years old when it was issued in 2019. Aria searched online on her laptop using the weak Wi-Fi signal from the inn and found a missing person report filed in 2020 for James Chen, a travel photographer who had disappeared while documenting small towns in the Pacific Northwest. The last place his credit card had been used was at a gas station 40 miles from Thornwick. The discovery gave Aria the clarity and motivation she needed. Whatever happened at the Harvest Festival, it was not a harmless tradition, and she was not going to wait around to become another missing person whose belongings ended up hidden in the inn. As evening approached and she heard the sounds of the festival beginning in the town's square, the drums and chanting growing louder, she made her decision. She would not try to escape through the front of the inn or to her car. Instead, she would go out through her second-floor window, climb down using the porch trellis, and make her way through the forest on foot. It was risky, and she might become lost in the vast wilderness that surrounded Thornwick. But it was a better option than staying and discovering what fate the townspeople had planned for her. She waited until the chanting reached a fever pitch, and she could hear that the entire town had gathered in the square for the ceremony. Then she opened her window as quietly as possible, threw her backpack with her laptop and camera down into the bushes below, and began to climb down the trellis. The wood was old and rotten, and it cracked alarmingly under her weight, but it held long enough for her to reach the ground. She retrieved her bag and began to run toward the tree line, moving as quickly and quietly as she could through the darkness. Behind her, she could hear the festival continuing, could see the orange glow of enormous fires burning in the town square, could smell smoke and something else, something chemical and wrong that made her run faster. She had nearly reached the safety of the forest when she heard the shout behind her. They had discovered her absence. She could hear voices calling her name, could hear the sound of people running, could see flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as they began to search for her. Aria plunged into the forest and ran blindly through the undergrowth, branches tearing at her face and clothes, roots threatening to trip her with every step. She ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes, until her lungs burned and her legs threatened to give out. Finally, she stopped behind a massive fallen log to catch her breath and listen for sounds of pursuit. She could hear nothing but the wind in the trees and the sound of her own ragged breathing. It took her all night to find her way to the county highway, navigating by the stars when she could see them through the canopy, and by instinct when she could not. When she finally stumbled onto the paved road just after dawn, she flagged down the first vehicle she saw, a logging truck whose driver took one look at her torn clothes and terrified expression and agreed to take her to the nearest police station. She told the officers everything, about the festival, about the effigies, about James Chen's belongings, about being held against her will. They listened with expressions of professional skepticism and agreed to investigate. 3 days later, they told her that they had driven to the location she had described, but there was no town there. The road she had indicated led only to an abandoned logging camp that had been closed since the 1960s. There were no residents, no buildings, no evidence that anyone had been there in decades. When Aria insisted that she had photographs, she discovered that every image she had taken in Thornwick had been corrupted, replaced by static and darkness. The only proof she had was James Chen's driver's license, which she had grabbed from the backpack before climbing out the window. The police added it to his missing person file, but they made it clear they thought Aria had found it somewhere else and had constructed an elaborate story around it. Aria never went back to that part of Oregon, never tried to find Thornwick again, never spoke publicly about what had happened to her. But sometimes, late at night, she would search online for information about vanishing towns and missing people. And she would find others who told similar stories of communities that appeared and disappeared, of festivals that required participants, of escapes made just in time. And she would look at the one photograph that had survived the corruption of her memory card, an image she had taken on her first day in Thornwick that showed the town square with its brick buildings and hand-painted signs. If you looked closely at the edges of the frame, you could see figures standing in the shadows, watching the camera, waiting. This happened in 2019, but David still remembered every single detail about what he discovered quite vividly. It was so random and so distinctly horrifying that he would never forget what was hidden beneath Pinewood Community Church in rural Mississippi. The incident was so disturbing and so unexpected that it fundamentally changed how David viewed the communities he worked in and made him question how many other secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of seemingly normal American towns. At the time, David was 28 years old and working as an independent contractor specializing in historical building renovation. He had built a solid reputation for restoring old churches throughout the South, preserving their architectural character while updating them to meet modern safety codes. When he received the call from Pastor Franklin of Pinewood Community Church, he had been pleased to take on the project. The church was over 100 years old, a beautiful white clapboard structure with Gothic Revival windows and a bell tower that had been featured in several books about Southern architecture. The congregation was small, maybe 40 regular attendees, in a town of 400 people. But they had raised enough money through bake sales and donations to afford necessary repairs to the sanctuary and the installation of updated electrical systems. David arrived in Pinewood on a Monday in June and met with Pastor Franklin, a man in his early 60s with a warm handshake and an easy smile that suggested a lifetime spent putting people at ease. The pastor gave David a complete tour of the building, showed him the areas that needed the most work, and explained the congregation's vision for the restoration. Everything seemed straightforward and professional. Pastor Franklin gave David keys to the building and told him he was welcome to work whatever hours he needed, including evenings and weekends when the church would be empty. The only restriction the pastor mentioned was that David should not go into the basement, which was not part of the renovation project, and which contained only old records and storage that the congregation would sort through themselves at a later date. The instructions seemed reasonable enough, and David agreed without hesitation. He had no reason to go into the basement if it was not part of his contracted work. For the first 3 weeks, everything proceeded smoothly. David worked during the evenings to avoid the brutal Mississippi heat, arriving around 6 in the afternoon and working until midnight or later. The church was indeed empty during those hours, and he appreciated the quiet and the ability to focus on detailed work without interruption. He repaired water damage in the sanctuary ceiling, replaced rotted window frames, and began the process of rewiring the electrical system to bring it up to code. It was satisfying work, the kind of project that allowed him to see tangible progress each day. But as he worked, he became increasingly aware of the basement door. It was located in a hallway between the sanctuary and the small kitchen area, and it was immediately obvious that the door was much newer than the rest of the building. While the church itself dated to the 1890s, this door appeared to be recent construction, perhaps only a few years old. It was solid core, the kind of heavy security door one might see in a commercial building, and it had 3 separate locks: a deadbolt, a keyed entry lock, and a sliding bolt at the top. David told himself that the door was none of his business, and that old churches often had quirks and modifications that reflected changing needs over decades. But his curiosity grew stronger as the days passed, particularly because he noticed that Pastor Franklin visited the church late at night on several occasions, always entering through the back door and always spending exactly 1 hour inside before leaving. David knew the pastor was there because he would see his car parked behind the building, and he could hear footsteps and the sound of the basement door opening and closing. It struck him as odd behavior for a pastor whose only explanation for the basement had been that it contained old records and storage. Why would someone need to visit old records in the middle of the night? And why would storage require a door with 3 separate locks? The discovery happened on a Thursday evening in his 4th week on the project. David was working on replacing electrical outlets in the hallway when he noticed that the basement door was slightly ajar, the deadbolt not fully engaged. He assumed that Pastor Franklin had visited earlier and had forgotten to secure it properly. David's first instinct was to simply close the door and go back to work. But something made him pause. Perhaps it was the accumulation of small oddities he had noticed over the past weeks. Or perhaps it was simple human curiosity. But he found himself pushing the door open and looking down the basement stairs. The stairs were wooden and old, consistent with the age of the building. But they had been recently reinforced and were in excellent condition. A light was on at the bottom of the stairs, casting a pale yellow glow that did nothing to dispel the sense of wrongness that had begun to creep over David. He descended the stairs slowly, telling himself that he was simply making sure everything was secure and that there was nothing inappropriate about checking on a part of the building where he was working. The basement was larger than he had expected, a series of connected rooms that extended under the entire footprint of the church. The first room contained exactly what Pastor Franklin had described: boxes of old records, Christmas decorations, folding tables and chairs, and the accumulated detritus of decades of church activities. But there was another door at the far end of this room, and this door was also heavy and secure, though it stood open now. David walked through it and found himself in a space that made his blood run cold, and his professional instincts screamed that something was terribly wrong. The room had been converted into living quarters, but not the kind that suggested voluntary occupancy. There was a twin bed with a bare mattress and a thin blanket. There was a small toilet in the corner, the kind one might find in a prison cell, with no privacy screen or door. There were supplies stacked against one wall: cases of bottled water, canned foods, and what appeared to be medical supplies, including bandages and bottles of pills. But most disturbing were the restraints. Heavy chains had been bolted to the concrete wall, with cuffs that could secure a person's wrists and ankles. The walls were marked with scratches, as if someone had dragged their fingernails across the concrete in desperation. And there were children's toys scattered on the floor: a stuffed bear with matted fur, a coloring book with pages torn out, crayons worn down to nubs. The room smelled of bleach and something underneath the chemical scent, something organic and wrong that made David want to vomit. David pulled out his phone with shaking hands and began photographing everything. He documented the restraints, the living conditions, the supplies, the scratches on the walls, every detail that would serve as evidence of what he had found. His mind was racing with horror and disbelief. This was not old storage. This was a prison. Someone had been kept here, possibly multiple people over time, and the presence of children's items suggested victims who were young and vulnerable. As he photographed the final corner of the room, he heard a sound that made his heart stop. Footsteps at the top of the basement stairs. Someone had entered the church above him. David froze, every instinct telling him to hide, to run, to do anything but be discovered in this room where he was explicitly told not to go. He heard the footsteps descending the stairs, heard them crossing the first basement room, and then Pastor Franklin appeared in the doorway. The transformation in the pastor's demeanor was immediate and chilling. The warm, friendly expression vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating and utterly devoid of humanity. Pastor Franklin looked at David, looked at the phone in his hand, and said in a voice that carried no emotion whatsoever that David had made a terrible mistake. The pastor began to explain that some people in the community required correction and guidance, that the basement served a holy purpose in rehabilitating those who had strayed from righteousness, and that outsiders could never understand the difficult work that the church performed in keeping the town pure and godly. David did not wait to hear more. He shoved past Pastor Franklin with all the strength he could muster, knocking the older man off balance and sending him stumbling into the wall. David ran through the first basement room, up the stairs, and out of the church to his truck. His hands shook so badly that he could barely get the key in the ignition. But he managed to start the vehicle and drive directly to the county sheriff's office 20 miles away. He told them everything, showed them the photographs on his phone, and insisted that they needed to investigate immediately. The deputies listened with expressions that shifted from skepticism to horror as they looked at the images. They contacted state police and child protective services, and within hours, a full investigation team descended on Pinewood Community Church. What they found confirmed everything David had photographed, and worse. Forensic analysis revealed that the basement room had been used for years, possibly decades. DNA evidence linked the room to 3 missing children from surrounding counties, cases that had gone cold years earlier. Further investigation revealed that Pastor Franklin was part of a network that extended beyond Pinewood, involving multiple churches and multiple towns throughout rural Mississippi. The children had been taken under the guise of religious correction or reformation, held in basement prisons beneath churches, and subjected to abuse that the investigation reports described in terms so clinical that they failed to capture the true horror of what had happened. The congregation members were interviewed extensively. Some claimed complete ignorance. Others admitted they had suspected something but had been too afraid to speak out against church leadership that had controlled the town for generations. Pastor Franklin was arrested, along with 2 deacons and several congregation members who had been complicit in the crimes. The trial stretched over 2 years, with testimony that revealed a system of abuse that had operated in plain sight, hidden beneath a church that the community had trusted and supported. David testified at the trials, describing what he had found and how the discovery had unfolded. The accused were convicted and received sentences that would keep them in prison for the rest of their lives. But David knew that no amount of justice could undo the damage that had been done or bring back the years that had been stolen from children who had been imprisoned beneath a place that was supposed to represent sanctuary and hope. David never worked on another church restoration project after Pinewood. He could not bring himself to enter those spaces anymore without wondering what might be hidden in their basements or locked rooms. The experience had shown him that evil could wear any face and hide behind any institution, and that the most horrifying monsters were often the ones who stood in pulpits and smiled at their congregations every Sunday while keeping unspeakable secrets locked away in the darkness below. This happened when Evelyn had just moved to Coopersville, a dying mining town in West Virginia with a population that had dwindled to barely 300 souls clinging to a place that the rest of the world had forgotten. The town had been built in the 1920s around a coal mine that had provided employment for thousands of workers at its peak. But the mine had closed in 1987, and since then, Coopersville had been slowly hemorrhaging residents until only the most stubborn, the most poor, or the most trapped remained. Evelyn was 29 years old and had taken a job as a waitress at the Bluebird Diner, the only restaurant still operating in town, because she had fled an abusive relationship in Pittsburgh and needed a place where her ex-boyfriend would never think to look for her. Coopersville was certainly that. It was the kind of place that people left, not the kind of place anyone moved to by choice. And her co-workers at the diner had regarded her arrival with a mixture of curiosity and pity, as if they could not imagine what desperation would drive someone to voluntarily relocate to their dying town. The Bluebird Diner sat on Route 52, the two-lane highway that connected Coopersville to the larger towns in the valley below. The highway was the town's lifeline, its only real connection to the outside world. And it was also its curse. The road had been built in the 1930s, carved into the side of the mountain with hairpin turns and steep grades that made it treacherous even in good weather. In winter, when ice coated the asphalt and fog reduced visibility to almost nothing, the highway became a death trap. Evelyn learned during her first week of work that the stretch of Route 52 that ran through Coopersville had one of the highest accident fatality rates in the state. The evidence was impossible to miss. Both sides of the highway were lined with memorials, small white crosses and larger monuments marking the spots where people had died in crashes. Some were simple, just a name and a date. Others were elaborate, with flowers that were regularly replaced, photographs in weatherproof frames, stuffed animals, and personal items left by grieving families. Evelyn's daily commute to the diner took her past dozens of these memorials, and after a few weeks, she began to recognize individual ones and to learn the stories behind them from her co-workers and regular customers. There was the memorial for the Johnson family, all 5 of them killed when their van went off the road during a blizzard in 2003. There was the cross for Tommy Bryant, a 17-year-old who had been drag racing and had lost control on a curve in 1999. There was the elaborate stone marker for Elizabeth Crane, a young mother who had been killed by a drunk driver in 2015, leaving behind 3 children. The memorials were a constant reminder of how dangerous the road was, how many lives it had claimed, and Evelyn found herself driving with extreme caution, her hands tight on the steering wheel and her eyes constantly scanning for hazards. But there was one memorial that drew her attention more than the others, and she could not quite explain why. It was located at a sharp curve about halfway between her apartment and the diner, a spot where the highway bent around the mountainside and the shoulder dropped away into a steep ravine filled with trees and rocks. The memorial was old, weathered by decades of exposure to the elements, and it consisted of a white wooden cross with a name barely visible through the peeling paint. Sarah Miller, 1987. There were no flowers, no photographs, no personal items. Just the cross standing alone in the weeds at the edge of the pavement. What made it stand out to Evelyn was the figure she began to see standing beside it. The first time she saw the figure was during her second week in Coopersville, on a cold morning in early March when fog hung thick across the road and visibility was poor. As Evelyn navigated the curve where Sarah Miller's memorial stood, she glimpsed what appeared to be a person standing on the shoulder near the cross. The figure was indistinct in the fog, just a dark shape that might have been a person or might have been a trick of the light and the swirling mist. Evelyn slowed her car, concerned that someone might need help or might step into the road. But as she drew closer, the figure seemed to fade back into the fog and disappear. She told herself she had imagined it, that the combination of poor visibility and her own nervousness about the dangerous road had made her see things that were not there. But the figure appeared again the next morning, and the morning after that, always in the same spot near Sarah Miller's memorial, always visible only in her peripheral vision or through the fog. Evelyn began to notice a pattern. The figure appeared only at dawn, only when she was driving to work, and only at that specific location. If she looked directly at it, it seemed to become less distinct, almost transparent. But if she glanced at it from the corner of her eye, it appeared solid and real. The figure was always standing in the same position, facing the road as if waiting for something or watching for someone. Evelyn could not make out any details of face or clothing, could not even be certain of the figure's gender or age. But she felt an overwhelming sense of sadness emanating from it, a grief so profound that it seemed to saturate the air around the memorial. By the third week, Evelyn had convinced herself that she was experiencing some kind of psychological phenomenon, perhaps a manifestation of her own trauma and stress projected onto the landscape. She had been through a difficult period in her life, and it would not be surprising if her mind was playing tricks on her, creating phantoms out of fog and shadow. She mentioned the figure casually to one of her co-workers at the diner, a woman named Ruth who had lived in Coopersville her entire life and who seemed to know everything about everyone in town. Ruth's reaction was immediate and unsettling. Her face went pale, and she grabbed Evelyn's arm with surprising strength and asked her exactly what she had seen and exactly where. When Evelyn described the figure and the location of Sarah Miller's memorial, Ruth released her arm and took a step back, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. Ruth explained that Evelyn was not the first person to see the figure at Sarah Miller's memorial, and she would not be the last. Sarah Miller had been 19 years old in 1987 when she was killed in a hit-and-run accident at that exact spot on the highway. The driver had never been caught, had never been identified, and had never faced justice for taking Sarah's life. According to Ruth and other longtime residents of Coopersville, Sarah's ghost had been appearing at the site of her death ever since, always at dawn, always standing near her memorial. But she did not appear to everyone. She only appeared to specific people, to drivers who shared certain characteristics with the man who had killed her. Ruth would not specify exactly what those characteristics were, saying only that Sarah appeared to those who looked like her killer, and that her appearances were a warning or perhaps an accusation. The revelation should have frightened Evelyn, should have made her avoid that section of highway or change her route to work. But instead, it made her angry. The idea that she somehow resembled a hit-and-run driver, that she was being haunted or accused because of a superficial similarity to a person who had committed a terrible crime decades ago, seemed profoundly unfair. She began to deliberately look for the figure each morning, to stare directly at the memorial as she drove past, almost daring the ghost to show itself clearly. And the figure obliged. Each day it became more distinct, more solid, more present. By the fourth week, Evelyn could make out details. A young woman with long dark hair, wearing jeans and a jacket, standing with her arms at her sides and her face turned toward the road. The figure never moved, never gestured, never acknowledged Evelyn's presence in any obvious way. But Evelyn felt watched, felt judged, felt the weight of that silent accusation growing heavier with each passing day. Then the figure began to move closer to the road. Each morning it stood a few inches nearer to the pavement, a few inches closer to the path of Evelyn's car. The progression was subtle but unmistakable. And Evelyn realized with growing dread that the ghost was not content to simply watch anymore. By the end of the 4th week, the figure was standing at the very edge of the shoulder, so close to the road that Evelyn had to swerve slightly to avoid the spot where it stood. And then, on a Monday morning in late March, the figure stepped directly into the road in front of Evelyn's car. Evelyn saw the young woman materialize in the center of her lane, solid and real, her face finely visible and contorted in an expression of rage and grief. Evelyn screamed and jerked the steering wheel to the right, trying to avoid hitting the figure, but her car was traveling too fast on the dangerous curve. The vehicle skidded on the damp pavement, the tires losing traction, and Evelyn felt the sickening sensation of the car sliding sideways toward the edge of the road and the steep drop beyond. She managed to regain partial control and bring the car to a stop on the shoulder, her heart pounding and her hands shaking so violently she could barely grip the steering wheel. When she looked in her rearview mirror, the figure was gone, and the road behind her was empty. Evelyn sat in her car for 20 minutes, trying to calm down enough to drive the rest of the way to work. When she finally arrived at the diner, pale and shaken, Ruth took one look at her and pulled her into the back office. Evelyn told her what had happened, about the figure stepping into the road, about nearly going over the edge, about the terrible expression on the ghost's face. Ruth listened with the resigned air of someone who had heard similar stories before. She told Evelyn that Sarah Miller had caused accidents before, that she appeared to drivers and made them swerve, that 3 people had died at that same curve since Sarah's own death in circumstances eerily similar to Evelyn's near miss. The local police knew about it, Ruth said. But what could they do? How could they stop a ghost? How could they protect people from something that had no physical form and no rational explanation? Ruth advised Evelyn to take a different route to work, even if it meant adding 20 minutes to her commute by going around the mountain on back roads. But Evelyn discovered that avoiding Sarah Miller's memorial was not enough. The ghost followed her. On her new route, Evelyn began to see the same dark-haired figure standing at different roadside memorials, always watching, always waiting. She learned that there were 3 other memorials along Route 52 where similar stories were told, 3 other sites where the ghosts of accident victims appeared to drivers and caused them to crash. Coopersville's dangerous highway was haunted by the dead who had died there, and they were not resting peacefully. They were angry, and they were making the living pay for crimes both real and imagined. Evelyn lasted another 2 months in Coopersville before the constant fear and the recurring appearances of the roadside ghosts drove her to quit her job and leave town. She moved to a city in Ohio, as far from mountain highways and rural roads as she could get. And she never drove Route 52 again. But sometimes, when she was driving at dawn and saw a roadside memorial, she would feel a chill and would see, just at the edge of her vision, a figure standing and watching. The ghosts of Coopersville had marked her somehow, had claimed her as one of the people who looked like the ones who had wronged them, and she wondered if she would ever truly escape their silent accusations. When Joseph was 16 years old, his family moved to Grantsville, a town of just 500 people in rural Idaho, where his father had taken a job as a supervisor at the lumber mill that was the only significant employer for 50 miles in any direction. Joseph had not wanted to move. He had friends and a life back in Boise, and the idea of spending his last 2 years of high school in a town that was smaller than his old high school student body filled him with dread. But his father's new position came with a significant pay increase and the promise of job security, and after years of financial struggle, the family had no choice but to relocate. They moved into a modest 2-story house on Spruce Street in late August, just 2 weeks before school was scheduled to start. And Joseph resigned himself to being the new kid in a place where everyone else had known each other since kindergarten. The first people they met were their next-door neighbors, the Rogers family. They lived in a house that was slightly larger and much better maintained than Joseph's family's rental, with a manicured lawn and fresh paint that spoke to old money and established position in the small town's social hierarchy. Mr. Rogers owned the hardware store on Main Street, and Mrs. Rogers worked as the secretary at the high school, which meant that within a day of moving in, Joseph's mother knew where to shop and who to talk to about registering Joseph for classes. The Rogers had one son, Carter, who was also 16 and who would be in Joseph's grade when school started. Mrs. Rogers suggested that Carter could show Joseph around town and introduce him to other kids their age, and Carter seemed enthusiastic about the prospect. Greeting Joseph with a wide smile and an immediate invitation to come over and hang out. For the first week, having Carter as a guide to Grantsville seemed like a stroke of good fortune. Carter knew everyone and everything about the town. He showed Joseph the few places where teenagers gathered: the swimming hole in the creek behind the abandoned grain elevator, the parking lot at the grocery store where kids hung out on Friday nights, the hiking trails in the forest that surrounded the town on 3 sides. Carter introduced Joseph to other students who would be in their classes, and he vouched for Joseph's character in a way that seemed to smooth his acceptance into the social fabric of the high school. Joseph's parents were pleased that their son had made a friend so quickly, and they encouraged the relationship, inviting Carter over for dinner and praising him for being such a good influence. But as the second week progressed, Joseph began to notice aspects of Carter's behavior that made him uncomfortable. Carter had a way of showing up uninvited, appearing at Joseph's door at odd hours without calling first, or asking if it was a convenient time to visit. He would let himself into Joseph's house through the back door, which the family had not yet gotten into the habit of locking. And Joseph would discover Carter sitting in his room going through his belongings or reading his journal. When Joseph expressed surprise or mild annoyance at these intrusions, Carter would laugh and say that this was how things were done in small towns, that people did not stand on ceremony or worry about privacy the way they did in cities. Joseph tried to accept this explanation, tried to adjust his expectations to match what Carter insisted were normal small-town behaviors. But something about Carter's constant presence felt wrong in a way that Joseph struggled to articulate. The situation escalated after school started. Carter arranged his schedule so that he shared every possible class with Joseph, and he positioned himself so that they were always paired for group projects and lab assignments. He sat next to Joseph at lunch and discouraged other students from joining their table, creating an insular dynamic that left Joseph socially isolated, except for his connection to Carter. When Joseph tried to make other friends or spend time with different people, Carter would become visibly upset, accusing Joseph of being disloyal and reminding him that Carter was the only person who had been kind to him when he was new and friendless. The accusations stung because they contained an element of truth, and Joseph found himself apologizing and promising to be a better friend even though he could not identify what he had done wrong. Joseph's parents worked long hours, his father at the mill and his mother at a medical clinic in the next town over, which meant that Joseph was alone at home most afternoons and evenings. Carter began spending these unsupervised hours at Joseph's house, doing homework together or watching television. And while Joseph appreciated the company at first, he gradually realized that Carter's presence was not optional. If Joseph tried to say he had too much work to hang out or that he wanted some time alone, Carter would show up anyway, letting himself in through the back door and acting as if no refusal had been given. Joseph stopped locking his bedroom door because Carter would simply wait in the hallway or sit on the stairs outside Joseph's room until Joseph gave in and let him enter. The behavior felt increasingly possessive and controlling. But when Joseph tried to talk to his parents about it, they dismissed his concerns, said that Carter was just being a good friend and that Joseph should be grateful to have someone who cared about him so much. The situation reached a disturbing turning point in late September when Carter invited Joseph to see his room, which he had not shown Joseph before, despite Joseph having shown Carter his own room dozens of times. Joseph followed Carter next door and up to the second floor of the Rogers house, and when Carter opened his bedroom door, Joseph felt his stomach drop. The walls of Carter's room were covered with images of Joseph. There were photographs that Carter must have taken without Joseph's knowledge, printed and arranged in careful grids that covered entire walls. There were drawings of Joseph in various poses and settings, some realistic and some stylized, all executed with disturbing skill and attention to detail. There was a collage made from items that Joseph recognized as things he had lost or misplaced over the past month. A pen, a notebook, a t-shirt, a bracelet he had thought he left at school. Most disturbing were the writings, journal entries, and poetry that Carter had written about Joseph, describing feelings and fantasies that made Joseph's skin crawl and made him realize that Carter's attachment was not normal friendship, but something much darker and more obsessive. Joseph left Carter's house immediately, making an excuse about forgetting something and practically running back to his own home. He locked all the doors and windows, his hands shaking and his mind racing with horror at what he had seen. He tried calling his parents, but neither answered their phones, and he was left alone with the knowledge that Carter lived 20 feet away and knew every habit and vulnerability that Joseph had. Joseph tried to convince himself that he was overreacting, that the shrine was weird but not necessarily dangerous, that maybe this was how Carter expressed friendship and Joseph was interpreting it through an urban lens that did not account for rural social norms. But even as he tried to rationalize what he had seen, Joseph knew that something was profoundly wrong. That evening, Carter came to Joseph's door and knocked repeatedly, calling Joseph's name and asking why he had left so suddenly. Joseph did not answer, pretending he was not home. But he could see through the window that Carter was not fooled. Carter stood on the porch for over an hour, occasionally trying the door handle and peering through the windows, his expression shifting from confusion to hurt to something that looked like anger. When Joseph's parents finally came home around 9 o'clock, Carter was gone, but there was a note taped to the front door. It read, "You cannot avoid me. We are meant to be together. You will understand eventually." The note was written in the same handwriting that had covered the walls of Carter's room, and it was signed with both their names as if they were a unit. Carter and Joseph forever. Joseph showed his parents the note and tried to explain about the shrine in Carter's room, but his father dismissed it as teenage drama, and his mother suggested that Joseph had misunderstood Carter's intentions and that the images were probably just art projects for school. They refused to take the situation seriously, and Joseph realized with growing despair that he was on his own. Over the next 2 weeks, Carter's behavior became increasingly aggressive and unstable. He followed Joseph between classes, stood outside Joseph's house at night, and left gifts and notes in Joseph's locker that ranged from romantic to threatening. When Joseph tried to avoid him, Carter would corner him in empty hallways or bathrooms, demanding to know why Joseph was being cruel and insisting that they had a special connection that Joseph was betraying. The situation finally came to a head in mid-October, when Joseph woke at 2 in the morning to find Carter standing in his bedroom. Carter had broken in through a window that Joseph had thought was locked, and he was holding a knife that he said was to protect them both from people who would try to keep them apart. Joseph screamed, and his father came running, wresting the knife away from Carter and calling the police. Carter was arrested and charged with breaking and entering and assault with a weapon. During the investigation that followed, police discovered that Carter had a history of obsessive behavior toward other boys, a pattern that had been carefully hidden and managed by the Rogers family and by community members who had chosen to protect the family's reputation rather than address Carter's dangerous psychological issues. The investigation revealed that two families had quietly left Grantsville in the previous 5 years after their teenage sons had been targeted by Carter in ways similar to what Joseph had experienced. In both cases, the Rogers family had used their influence and money to convince the families to relocate rather than press charges or create a scandal. The town had been complicit in enabling Carter's behavior, valuing social harmony and the protection of a prominent family over the safety of vulnerable teenagers. The discovery filled Joseph with rage and a sense of betrayal not just by Carter, but by an entire community that had knowingly allowed a predator to operate among them. Carter was eventually sentenced to psychiatric treatment and probation, a punishment that Joseph's family and many others felt was inadequate given the severity of his actions and the pattern of behavior that had been documented. Joseph's family moved out of Grantsville before Christmas, unable to remain in a town that had protected their son's stalker and that continued to treat the Rogers family with deference and sympathy. Joseph carried the trauma of those months with him for years, struggling with trust and hypervigilance and anger at the adults who had failed to protect him. The experience taught him that small towns could be dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with crime rates or stranger danger. That the worst threats often came from within communities that closed ranks to protect their own and sacrificed outsiders to maintain an illusion of respectability and peace. Scarlett had been meaning to tell this story for years, but something had always stopped her. Some combination of fear and doubt and the creeping suspicion that no one would believe what had happened to her in Asherton, Texas. The incident had occurred in the summer of 2021 when she was 25 years old and traveling cross-country from California to North Carolina to start a new job as a graphic designer. She had decided to take the southern route and make a road trip out of it, stopping in small towns along the way to photograph interesting architecture and local landmarks for her personal portfolio. The plan had been to drive through the empty stretches of West Texas in one long push, stopping only for gas and food. But her car had other ideas. Somewhere between El Paso and San Antonio, on a desolate stretch of highway where the landscape was nothing but scrub brush and heat shimmer, her engine had started making a grinding noise that quickly escalated into a mechanical death rattle that forced her to pull over. She had managed to coast into Asherton, a town so small that it barely qualified as a town at all. The population sign at the town limits read 189, and from what Scarlett could see as she limped her dying car down Main Street, that number seemed optimistic. There was a gas station that looked abandoned, a post office that was open only 3 days a week according to the faded sign in the window, a general store with dusty windows displaying products that appeared not to have been moved in decades, and nothing else except houses that ranged from merely neglected to actively collapsing. The mechanic's shop was a single-bay garage attached to someone's house, and the mechanic, an older man who introduced himself simply as Frank, took one look under her hood and delivered the bad news. She had blown a gasket and cracked something important, and the parts would need to be ordered from San Antonio. It would take at least 3 days for them to arrive, possibly longer because it was a holiday weekend and shipping would be delayed. Scarlett felt panic rising in her chest. She had no family or friends within 500 miles. Her new job started in 10 days, and she could not afford to stay in a hotel for 3 days while waiting for car parts. Frank must have seen the distress on her face because he mentioned that Victoria Morris, a widow who lived at the edge of town, sometimes rented out a room to travelers who found themselves stranded in Asherton. The price would be reasonable, Frank assured her. And Victoria was a respectable woman who kept a clean house. Scarlett had no better options, so she accepted Frank's offer to call Victoria and arrange for her to stay there. Within an hour, she found herself standing on the porch of a weathered Victorian house that sat at the very end of a dirt road, separated from the rest of Asherton by at least a quarter mile of empty land. Victoria was a woman in her 70s, with sharp eyes and a manner that was polite but not warm. She showed Scarlett to a small bedroom on the second floor, quoted a price of $20 per night, and then delivered a warning that Scarlett did not fully understand at the time. Victoria said that Asherton was a quiet town where people minded their own business, and that Scarlett should not ask questions about the last house or about the people who had stayed in this room before her. The warning should have been a red flag, should have sent Scarlett running back to Frank's garage to sleep in her broken car if necessary. But exhaustion and heat and the lack of alternatives made her ignore her instincts. She agreed to Victoria's terms, paid for 3 nights in advance, and settled into the room. It was clean and sparsely furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a chair. There was no television, no Wi-Fi, and cell phone reception was almost non-existent. Scarlett unpacked her minimal belongings and lay down to rest, telling herself that 3 days would pass quickly and that this was just an unfortunate but temporary inconvenience in her journey. But that evening, as the sun set and the house settled into darkness, she heard a knock on her door. When she opened it, she found a teenage boy standing in the hallway. He was perhaps 16 or 17, thin and nervous, with eyes that darted around as if he was afraid of being caught. He introduced himself as Owen and said that he needed to talk to her immediately, that it was urgent and potentially a matter of life and death. Owen told her a story that seemed insane, but that he delivered with such genuine terror that Scarlett could not dismiss it. He said that Victoria's house, which locals called the last house because of its isolated position at the edge of town, had a dark history. Over the past decade, 5 people had rented that exact room where Scarlett was now staying. All 5 had been travelers passing through Asherton. All 5 had been young and alone, and all 5 had disappeared without a trace. Their cars would be gone from Frank's garage in the morning. Their belongings would be cleared from the room. And if anyone asked, Victoria would say they had decided to leave early and had paid their bill and departed. But Owen's older brother had been one of those renters 3 years ago. And Owen knew that his brother would never have left without calling home, would never have abandoned his car, which was later found at a junkyard in Mexico with the VIN numbers filed off. Owen had been investigating his brother's disappearance for years, and he had found evidence that Victoria was not working alone, that there was something organized and deliberate happening in Asherton, and that Scarlett needed to leave immediately before she became the 6th victim. Scarlett wanted to believe that Owen was exaggerating or paranoid or suffering from unresolved grief over his brother's disappearance. But something in his desperation convinced her to take him seriously. She asked him why he had not gone to the police, and Owen laughed bitterly and said that the sheriff was Victoria's cousin, and that everyone in Asherton either participated in or turned a blind eye to whatever was happening at the last house. He urged her to leave with him right then, said he would drive her to the next town where she could call for a tow truck or rent a car or do anything except stay in Victoria's house for another night. Scarlett agreed and began throwing her belongings into her bag. But before they could leave the room, they heard Victoria's voice calling from downstairs, asking if everything was all right and saying that she had heard voices. Owen's face went white, and he whispered that they needed to go immediately, that Victoria must not know that he had warned Scarlett. They tried to leave through the bedroom window, but it was painted shut and would not open. They tried the back stairs, but Victoria was standing at the bottom, blocking their exit. Scarlett realized with sick certainty that she was trapped. That Owen's presence had alerted Victoria to the fact that her pattern had been disrupted, and that whatever happened to the previous renters was about to happen to her. But Owen, who knew the house from years of secret investigation, grabbed Scarlett's hand and pulled her into a closet, then pushed aside a false back panel that revealed a narrow space between the walls. They squeezed into the gap and pulled the panel shut behind them just as they heard Victoria entering the bedroom. They could hear her searching the room, opening drawers and checking under the bed, muttering to herself about interference and schedules and how the boy was becoming a problem that needed to be solved. They waited in the darkness between the walls for what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. When they finally heard Victoria go back downstairs, Owen led Scarlett through the gap to a place where it opened into the basement. What Scarlett saw there confirmed every terrible thing Owen had told her. The basement contained belongings that clearly did not belong to Victoria. Suitcases, backpacks, personal items, and most damning of all, identification documents. Scarlett saw driver's licenses and passports belonging to people she did not know. But Owen identified his brother's wallet among the collection. Scarlett used her phone to photograph everything, every piece of evidence she could capture in the low light. Then Owen led her out through a basement window, and they ran to his truck, which he had parked a quarter-mile away to avoid being seen. Owen drove Scarlett to the state police barracks in the next county, and she filed a report describing everything she had seen and providing the photographs from her phone. The investigation that followed revealed that Victoria Morris had been operating a scheme targeting stranded travelers for over 15 years. The victims' vehicles were sold to shops. Their belongings were kept as trophies, and their identities were used for various forms of fraud. Authorities were never able to determine what had actually happened to the victims themselves. No bodies were ever found, and Victoria refused to cooperate or provide any information. She was convicted based on the physical evidence and sentenced to life in prison. But the fate of the people who had stayed in the last house remained a mystery that haunted Scarlett. The story should have ended there, but it did not. 6 months after Victoria's conviction, Scarlett began receiving phone calls from an unknown number with an Asherton area code. When she answered, there would be breathing on the other end, but no voice, just the sound of someone listening. The calls came at odd hours, sometimes in the middle of the night, sometimes during her workday, always from a number that could not be traced and that was disconnected whenever she tried to call it back. The calls continued for years, sometimes stopping for months at a time before resuming with renewed frequency. Scarlett changed her number 3 times, but somehow the calls always found her again. She could never prove that they were connected to what had happened in Asherton, could never explain how someone was getting her new numbers or why they were targeting her. But she knew in her bones that she had uncovered something in that town the powerful people wanted kept secret, and that they were reminding her that they knew where she was and could reach her whenever they chose. Zoe was a 27-year-old journalist from Seattle who had built a respectable career investigating fringe communities and unexplained phenomena for a regional alternative newspaper that specialized in long-form investigative pieces. She was very used to chasing strange stories, and over the past 5 years she had covered everything from cult compounds in eastern Washington to unsolved disappearances along the Canadian border to rumors of organized crime networks operating in logging towns. Her editor valued her willingness to go places other journalists would not, and to ask questions that made people uncomfortable. But nothing in her experience had prepared her for what she would encounter in Coldwater, Montana, a town that existed on paper, but seemed to defy every rational explanation for how communities functioned. The story that brought Zoe to Coldwater came from a reader tip, an anonymous email sent to the newspaper's general inbox that described a town with an emergency broadcast system that activated at random intervals with instructions that residents followed without question or explanation. The tipster claimed to have driven through Coldwater once and had heard the broadcast warning people to stay inside and turn off their lights, which every resident had immediately obeyed as if it were a practice drill. The email provided coordinates, but no other contact information. And when Zoe tried to research the town online, she found almost nothing beyond a mention in a 1970 census report that listed Coldwater's population as 342. There were no recent news articles, no social media presence, no business listings. Nothing that suggested the town still existed or that anyone who lived there interacted with the outside world. Zoe arrived in Coldwater on a gray afternoon in late September after driving for 7 hours through increasingly remote mountain roads that wound through national forest land and private timber holdings. The town appeared suddenly around a curve, a cluster of perhaps 50 buildings arranged along a single main street with residential houses spreading out into the surrounding hills. Everything looked functional but dated, as if Coldwater had been frozen in time around 1985 and had not changed or modernized since then. The cars parked along the street were old models. The storefronts had hand-painted signs, and there was no visible cell phone tower or satellite dishes that would indicate modern connectivity. Zoe checked into the only motel, a single-story building with 8 units arranged in an L shape around a gravel parking lot. The clerk who registered her was a man in his 40s who spoke in monosyllables and avoided making eye contact, taking her cash payment without asking for identification or having her sign any paperwork. Zoe spent the first day walking through Coldwater and attempting to conduct interviews with residents about the emergency broadcast system. Her reception was uniformly cold and suspicious. People would see her approaching with her notebook and camera and would immediately turn and walk in the other direction. Shop owners would suddenly remember they were closing early when she tried to enter their businesses. The few people who would speak to her at all insisted that there was no emergency broadcast system and that she must be thinking of some other town. But Zoe noticed details that contradicted their denials. Every building had speakers mounted on the exterior walls. Old-fashioned loudspeakers like the kind used for tornado warnings in the Midwest. Every residence had blackout curtains in every window. Heavy fabric that would block all interior light from being visible outside. And most tellingly, everyone she encountered seemed nervous and kept glancing at their watches or at the sky as if anticipating something. The emergency siren went off at exactly 3 o'clock in the morning, jolting Zoe awake from a light sleep in her motel room. The sound was deafening, a mechanical wail that seemed to come from every direction at once. And it was followed by a recorded voice speaking through the loudspeakers mounted throughout the town. The voice was male, flat and emotionless, and it delivered instructions with the authority of someone who expected absolute compliance. Lock your doors, turn off your lights. Do not look outside. Do not attempt to leave your homes. Do not make any sound. This will continue until the all-clear signal is given. The message repeated 3 times, and then the siren stopped, leaving behind a silence so complete that Zoe could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Zoe went to her window and carefully pulled back the curtain to look outside. The town was completely dark. Every light extinguished, every window covered. The only illumination came from the moon, which cast everything in shades of silver and black. She could see nothing moving, no cars, no people, no animals, nothing but empty streets and shuttered buildings. The silence was oppressive and wrong, as if the entire town was holding its breath and waiting for something terrible to pass. Zoe stood at the window for perhaps 10 minutes, watching and waiting. And then the all-clear signal sounded, a single long tone from the sirens. And within seconds, lights began to appear in windows throughout Coldwater, as if nothing unusual had happened. The next morning, Zoe tried to ask the motel clerk about the broadcast, but he simply stated that she must have been dreaming and that there had been no siren during the night. His denial was so blatant and so obviously false that Zoe felt a chill of real fear. Something was happening in Coldwater, something that every resident knew about and participated in, and they were all committed to keeping it secret from outsiders. She spent the day exploring the edges of town, looking for any clue that would explain the broadcast and the collective behavior it triggered. She found nothing except more speakers, dozens of them positioned throughout the residential areas and along the roads, all connected to underground cables that led toward a building at the center of town that appeared to be some kind of communications hub or radio station. The broadcast came again that night, and the night after, always at 3 a.m, always with the same instructions delivered in the same emotionless voice. But on the third night, the message included an additional instruction that made Zoe's blood freeze. A violation has been detected in Unit 6. Compliance will be enforced. Unit 6 was 2 doors down from Zoe's room, and she watched through her window as the lights in that unit went dark in the middle of the all-clear period. She heard nothing, no sounds of struggle or alarm. But when morning came, the car that had been parked outside Unit 6 was gone. And when she asked the clerk about it, he insisted that no one had been staying in that unit and that Zoe was mistaken about what she had seen. Zoe realized that she needed to leave Coldwater immediately, that whatever was happening in this town was dangerous, and that her presence had been noticed and was being tolerated only as long as she did not interfere or break the rules. But when she tried to drive out of town on the 4th morning, she found the road blocked by orange construction barriers and signs indicating that the highway was closed due to rock slides. There was no evidence of any rock slide, no debris or damage, just barriers that had not been there when she arrived. She tried the other road out of town and found it similarly blocked. She was trapped, and the realization sent waves of panic through her chest. That afternoon, while frantically searching her motel room for any option or escape route, Zoe found something hidden behind the loose baseboard under the sink. It was a notebook, small and water-damaged, filled with handwritten notes in cramped handwriting. The notebook belonged to someone named Marcus Chen, and according to the dates on the entries, he had been in Coldwater in August of 1982, investigating the same phenomenon that had brought Zoe there. Marcus had documented everything. The 3 a.m. broadcasts that occurred every single night without fail, the violations and disappearances of people who did not follow instructions, his own growing fear and paranoia as he realized he could not leave. The final entry was dated August 28, 1982, and it read, "I understand now. The broadcasts are not random. They are training. The town is preparing for something, has been preparing for decades. I have been noticed. Tomorrow, I will try to escape during daylight hours before the barriers go up. If you find this, do not make the same mistakes I made. Leave before you understand." The entry ended there, mid-sentence, as if Marcus had been interrupted or had run out of time. Following Marcus's advice, Zoe packed only her most essential belongings and left the motel at noon, driving toward the roadblocks as if she intended to turn around, but then veering off onto a Forest Service road that she had noticed during her explorations. The dirt road was rough and barely maintained, but it headed in the general direction of the county highway, and it was her only option. She drove for 45 minutes through dense forest, her car bouncing over ruts and rocks, until she finally emerged onto a paved road that she recognized as being outside Coldwater's immediate area. She did not stop driving until she reached Missoula 4 hours later, and even then she felt the urge to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between herself and the town that had held her captive. Zoe returned to Coldwater 3 weeks later with state police and officials from the county sheriff's department, determined to expose what was happening there and to find answers about Marcus Chen and the person who had disappeared from Unit 6. But when they arrived at the coordinates where Coldwater should have been, they found nothing. There was a clearing in the forest where a town might once have stood, but there were no buildings, no roads, no infrastructure, no evidence that anyone had lived there in decades. The police checked their maps and their GPS systems and confirmed that they were at the correct location. But Coldwater simply did not exist. Zoe's photographs from her time in the town were corrupted, every image replaced by static or darkness. Her audio recordings were erased. The only physical evidence that survived was Marcus Chen's notebook, which she had kept in her possession the entire time. The authorities filed a report noting the discrepancy, but took no further action. As far as they were concerned, Zoe had experienced some kind of stress-related episode or had been the victim of an elaborate hoax, though they could not explain who would create such a hoax or why. Zoe's editor ran a shortened version of her story, but it was treated as an unsolved mystery rather than as investigative journalism, and most readers dismissed it as creative fiction. Zoe tried to move on, tried to focus on other stories and other investigations. But Coldwater haunted her in ways that went beyond simple trauma or fear. Every month since her escape, Zoe received an envelope in the mail with no return address and a postmark from a different location each time. Inside each envelope was a single photograph showing the clearing where Coldwater had been. But in each photograph, there was one new person standing in the center of the frame. The person was always different. A young woman in hiking gear, an older man in business clothes, a teenager with a backpack, people who looked like travelers or tourists or researchers. None of them ever looked directly at the camera. They all stood with their backs turned, facing toward the tree line, as if waiting for permission to enter something that Zoe could not see. She kept all the photographs in a locked box, documenting them and trying to identify the people. But she never found any answers. The photographs suggested that Coldwater was still operating, still claiming new residents or victims, still existing in a space that defied conventional geography and rational explanation. And Zoe knew that somewhere in Montana there was a town that appeared and disappeared according to rules she would never understand. A place where emergency broadcasts trained people for purposes that remained hidden, and where anyone who broke the pattern simply ceased to exist.